In other news tonight, a young man from Coeur d'Alene is changing the way people around him look at life.
KREM 2's Rob Harris had the privilege of sitting down with Brenden Nichols and shares his inspiring story.
So we got your application we got done for Eastern.
It's just around noon, and 24-year-old Brenden Nichols is sitting down for lunch with his mom, Jody.
Take me back to Brendan's childhood. What was the character trait that stood out for Brenden growing up?
He was 40 years old in a 5-year-old body. He wanted to parent all the other little kids.
And so growing up and seeing this 40-year-old in a 5-year-old's body, what did you picture his future to look like?
I figured he'd be really successful. He was always really driven. He was a straight-A student.
The good grades and the drive all had a purpose for Brenden. At age 18, he began his studies at Carroll College, aiming to be a neurosurgeon, because as he puts it, the brain is the final frontier. But on October 15th, 2011, those plans changed.
Oh, I remember the whole accident. I was driving on the Lolo Pass, which is a pretty curvy road. I came around the corner and the river's on the left, mountains on the right, and deer jumps off the mountain. I was about to go over the edge. I wrenched the wheel the other way, overcorrecting. I hit my head on the steering wheel and was knocked unconscious.
I got that call at 4 o'clock in the morning. All they could tell us was that he was still breathing when they put him in the ambulance, but we needed to get to Missoula as soon as possible. At that point, you kind of aren't thinking, you're just on autopilot. And I actually called my next door neighbor to ask them if they would come help me because I wasn't sure I could drive. She drove me to Missoula. We got there really fast. I think we got there in about 90 minutes. And when I got there, they take you into the little room and they tell you what's going on. And that little room is my nightmare. And they had told me that he had a severe brain injury and that the likelihood that he would survive was slim. The next 72 hours would be critical. At 72 hours, we were ecstatic that he was still alive. And then we met with this neurosurgeon. And he literally told us that euthanasia would be a better option for our son than the life he was going to live. And at that point, you kind of as a parent collapse. And it makes me teary thinking about it. But once I got my composure back, I decided that I didn't want that surgeon anywhere near my son because he didn't know my son. And I wanted to give him a chance.
While not every doctor that the Nichols family spoke to had an equally grim prognosis, each told the family that the chances of Brenden returning to a normal life were slim, but they weren't ready to give up.
I had done this big memory board for him, and I'm kind of crafty. And I put just different accomplishments he'd have, whether it been as a family member, as a brother, as Boy Scouts. Anybody who came into that room, I made them look at that board. And I wanted them to see who this was, not who was in the bed. And the prognosis that they'd given him, I wanted them to give him a chance.
Brenden was in a coma basically for 4 months, with some brief moments of increased awareness. He was making gradual progress though, and he was able to be transferred out of ICU and moved to a hospital in North Idaho. That's where he first met Dr. Todd Hoopman.
Do you remember the first time you saw Brenden Nichols?
I do. He was not awake. He would mostly lay in bed during the days, but there were periods of time where he was somewhat more alert, but not responsive. He couldn't speak and really wasn't engaged with his environment in any way.
When you saw him in that condition, what did you think was his long-term outlook?
You know, it was really hard to predict at that time. He was still fairly recent from his injury, and the tricky thing about head injuries is it's very hard to predict long-term outcomes. Certainly the level of injury that he had had was on the very concerning end of that spectrum.
The Nichols family kept hoping and praying and rearranging their lives to make sure Brenden was never alone. And doctors and therapists kept working with him too. hoping that he could regain his consciousness and ability to speak. And then one day, a breakthrough. Brenden gave a thumbs up, and he kept improving from there.
He was working with a speech and language pathologist, and she had held up a card that said make a fist, and he did it, and I'm like, oh my God, he can read. And I was like, that's huge.
As Brenden became more and more conscious, doctors and family began to realize just how much of a miracle he was. Despite trouble speaking and some memory issues, his cognitive ability today is pretty much exactly what it was before his accident. In fact, Brenden says one of his biggest frustrations is that some people assume he can't understand them just based on the way he speaks.
Just because someone can't speak well doesn't mean that they can't think well. I may talk slowly, but I sure as heck don't think slowly.
Wow, what a
He's
recovery.
amazing.
No kidding. As Brendan's consciousness comes back, the physical impact of his accident remained. When he left the hospital, he had to rely on a wheelchair, and doctors weren't sure what mobility, if any, he would regain.
But as you saw, nothing seems to keep Brenden back. So tomorrow we'll share part 2 of his inspiring story. I know I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, no kidding, me too.